Hello and welcome back to the Good Leader podcast. It's great to have you here. I'm Will van der Hart.
I'm Will James.
And we are so delighted to have my dear friend Patrick Regan on the podcast today. Patrick, welcome.
It's brilliant to be here, so good.
Yeah, thanks for coming. We've been friends for a really long time. We met at a leadership conference, I think about 14 years ago, pray together with you regularly. It feels like your story is like a lot bigger than the sort of 20 minutes we have for this podcast. We're going to kind of go bite-sized today. And I want to just start off with your journey into XLP, which was known, whether rightly or wrongly, it was known as the kind of Guns and Gangs charity, because you really did a pioneering work sort of intervening in some of the most deprived estates in London when the kind of knife crime epidemic, if you like, hit the headlines. Just say a bit about your entry into that ministry. That was, I think you ran that ministry for 22 years, so a really significant amount of time.
Yeah, so I was a youth worker at a church in South London, and there'd been a stabbing in the school down the road. And so the school phoned the church up and said, can you help us get the moral fibre of our school up? And the vicar didn't really fancy it, so sent me as a local youth worker to see what I could do. And I really arrived in this school and said, you know what, as local church, we believe in serving our local community. What can we do to serve? What can we do to help? This one school had 65 mother tongue languages. So it wasn't that the kids were thick or stupid. They just didn't understand what was being taught. So I started helping with literacy and numeracy. I started doing school assemblies. I remember a kid came up to me after a school assembly. He was wearing a bulletproof vest underneath his school uniform. And he said, I'll be dead by next week. I thought he was bragging. 6 weeks later, he gets stabbed in the neck by a year 11 kid. He was in year 10. And so I found 17 people to give me £25 a month, and I started XLP. I moved right into the heart of Peckham, just down the road from where a young lad called Damilola Taylor, who was 10 years old, got stabbed with a broken bottle. He bled to death in a stairwell in Peckham. And then we just try to make a difference, Will, and by doing all sorts of intervention stuff. And the charity grew at quite a rate, got the attention of politicians and the royals, and everyone was looking for solutions. And because these are massive issues that affect everyone.
Yeah. I remember the XLP buses.
Yeah.
You had buses that you transformed into kind of the amazing buses with PlayStations and Xboxes, and they decked them out. It's just like they were like mini youth clubs.
Yeah.
And then they drive them into estates, and then they'd be a hub for youth work and engaging young people. It was amazing and an amazing kind of God-given gift to communities at the time. It was quite a radical set of ideas.
I mean, one of my favourite ones was we got this police riot van, and there was a programme on MTV at the time called Pimp My Ride. And so me and a borough commander, a good friend of mine, John Sutherland, we approached MTV and said, would you pimp it and turn it into a mobile recording studio? And then we'll take it onto some of the toughest estates in London and work with young people. And they did. I mean, it cost ridiculous amount of money and became the most watched programme on MTV that year. And so we had this bizarre situation where people want to get on a police riot van rather than avoid a police riot van, which sort of flipped the script a little bit, which I think is quite cool.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, I remember obviously, you were, often when there was a stabbing, you were often on the television or on the radio. I remember Boris Johnson kind of getting behind XLP at the time. I think when he was London mayor and putting, a lot of energy, identifying it as one of the most sort of significant and important charities in his tenure as London mayor. So a lot of energy around that. But just aware of that, of you as a leader in the middle of that, not only you're fundraising,
Yeah.
you're also managing a huge amount of youth workers and people who have just come out of uni and are sort of fresh into the workplace, but also you're confronting amazing amount of like really, really horrible crimes. So you've got like youth stabbings, youth gang violence, there was sexual assaults, there's all sorts of stuff happening. How are you coping, like looking back at everything that was going on around you, and also sort of the emotional impacts of that?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that when I first started, I had not a clue on the emotional impact that it would have on me, because I think I was young, enthusiastic, passionate about what I was doing, was really trying to inspire the church to get involved in huge issues, not around just gangs and knife crime, but educational failure, issues around family, deprivation, high unemployment, all these massive issues. So I felt like I just threw myself into it, and to be honest, around those times, we weren't really talking about mental or emotional health. I mean, you guys pioneered the way really in mind and soul. And so it definitely had an effect on me. But I think what we do, and I've done this a lot, is we play top trumps with pain. So I was like, I'm struggling with all these emotions, particularly when someone gets killed on my patch, and I've had to go into a gold meeting, which is when you discuss the murder with the police and the community. But obviously what the family are going through is bigger than what I'm going through. So I play top trumps with pain. I say, your pain's bigger than my pain, so I'm not going to talk about my pain. And so then you suppress it. It's a bit like COVID. My sister was an ITU nurse, so she saw things that no one should ever have to see in life. And so I struggled during COVID, but I didn't really tell many people, particularly my family, because what she was going through is bigger than what I'm going through. And I think as leaders, sometimes we can play that comparison game, particularly when you're surrounded by pain. But in that situation, no one wins. You don't win because you're starting to give out of an empty cup, and that's the challenge. I used to say to people, I felt like my life was like, if I get my mobile phone works as well on 10% as it does 100%. There's nothing my phone can't do on 10% that can do on 100%. It just doesn't last very long. So what I was doing is, because I'm quite self-aware, is I was going for it, absorbing all this stuff and other people's issues, staff, because a lot of staff work for charities because they've been through similar issues. So it touches a thing in them, and they need healing as well, like we all do. And I'd go hard and I'd go, I'm on 10%, I'll plug in. I'd get up to 30% and I'd be like, I feel quite better now. And off we go again. And I feel like you can live like that for years, but then suddenly, boom, something's going to hit your left field. And that's definitely what happened to me.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, well, it's amazing sitting here with you now. And the thoughts coming to me is how quick you look to smile and to see the kind of levity and the lightness in life. And how did you get there then? How do you take trauma with a small t, trauma with a big T, and find this place of access and resilience to be able to find joy, find laughter?
Yeah. It's a massive process, and I think for me, the left field stuff was when your family start to get affected. Because I feel like you can deal with most things as leaders. When it's out, then, you've got skills, you know how to communicate well. But then when your kids get sick, you're like, oh my goodness, this is hitting below the belt, And I had to actually go through major limb reconstruction surgery. So Will will know this, I had both my legs in massive metal frames, which were on for 6 months to 18 months. I was ringing Will in the hospital going, I think I'm having a panic attack. And it was horrendous. It was like that Tetris. You remember the game Tetris? It all caves at once. And when I speak to leaders, they're like, oh yeah, I have had a Tetris moment, and I've had a Tetris moment. And I think at that point, it's like all the stuff that as a leader goes out the window. You're like, all the things you would tell other people that you need to do, you need to get your prayer time, you need to talk to people. You just go into fight, flight, or freeze. And so for me, it's all around what were those small choices that I can make on a day-to-day basis that were going to bring me into a better place of healing and well-being. And it was, it was everything from friendship. It was getting therapy, getting counselling, going to the doctors and going, I'm not doing very well. And as a bloke, we're rubbish at that. And the stigma that, again, in those days was really attached to that sort of thing, And then ultimately going, I am not the hero. I can't solve these problems. One of the big things for me, Will, was understanding what empathy is and what it isn't. And, I think it's, there's two types of empathy. There's that cognitive empathy. So if Will's lonely, I can understand loneliness because I've been lonely. But I don't think, and Brené Brown does a lot on this, I can step into Will's shoes because he's got different history, different DNA, and would experience it differently. But I can relate to him because I can relate to that loneliness. I can get in touch with that feeling of loneliness when I felt lonely, but I'm not stepping in his shoes. And I realised I can't step into these kids' shoes because their history is different. I can relate to them in certain ways and I've got certain experiences. And actually that cognitive empathy is actually quite healthy because it means you don't absorb their pain. Emotional empathy is going, that's it, I'm going to stand in your shoes and your pain is my pain. And then what you do is you burn out. And, you know, my biggest lesson to people is like, we're not the hero. Jesus is the hero. And, you know, Samuel Wells says, you know, the story of the Good Samaritan that gets quoted by so many people, particularly in urban communities. It's like, you know, he said when that story is described in the East, the Good Samaritan is always Jesus and we're the broken one. Whereas we're in the West, we're always the hero. Yeah, we're always the one helping, you know, and actually we need to flip that. And I think when we get rid of the them and us, then actually we can start to make small choices for healing. And I think that's more sustainable then.
Such a helpful distinction, Patrick. You know, I think that projection of being the hero of your story. And you went, you know, I felt like in our early conversations, you were dealing with that tension and you were saying to me, I don't know what they think I can do. Yeah. So you were aware of your fragility and you were aware of your limitation, but it's also possible that other people's projections onto leaders is so powerful that almost escaping the hero narrative is impossible, because it's like, and also the more successful you are and the more you're saying, no, it's got nothing to do with me. Like, I mean, I'm just playing my part. Everyone else is going, oh, and they're humble as well, you know, like, oh, and they're such a good guy, you know. So this sort of almost creates even more problems. But the sort of energy around leadership, particularly when you're doing something which everyone recognizes is so good and so important, but then that, like described with a phone being a super low battery, but just needing to scrape through.
So I'm wondering whether there's another question about, I love that distinction between kind of cognitive and emotional empathy, and like actually how does it really benefit anyone if our aim is to try and feel their feelings rather than being with them. This invitation to be with. And so is there another question about how do you find the resources and resource yourself just to be with people in an effective and creative way?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because I think for me, I mean, recently I've just done a lot of, I've just become an accredited teacher with the Centre of Compassionate Leadership, which is very much looking at compassion is a verb, it's solution focused. So empathy as part of compassion is really, really helpful, you know, so you can be aware of someone's suffering, you can connect to it, you can have empathy, but it has to move around to solution. And then of course, when you start thinking like that, you know, one of the biggest things for me was around self-compassion, because I just thought, you know, self-compassion was self-indulgence. You know, I'm like, I literally can't deal with those sort of it's all about me type songs. And there's so much about some of that stuff I struggle with. But then when someone said to me, well, actually self-compassion is talking to yourself the way you would talk to your best friend. So when you're struggling, compassion is solution focused. And so self-compassion is solution focused in the sense that it's dealing with that inner narrative, that inner critic, if you like, that always tells you you should work harder, you should go the extra mile, because often we look up to leaders, you know, who've done that. You know, it's interesting when you ask people who's resilient, then people go, oh, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, don't get me wrong, was a brilliant leader, inspiring, brilliant communicator, but was also in hospital for fatigue. Also struggled relationally, incredibly, you know. And so it's going, I've just got to find those tools. And I think for me, self-compassion probably is the key one, to go, and I need to be kinder to myself. Over the years, I've got to meet some amazing people. And one of the guys I've spent quite a lot of time with in recent years is a guy called Terry Wake. He was held captive in Lebanon for 5 years. For 4 years, he was blindfolded. He never saw, it was locked down on a different level. And he'd gone through so much trauma. You know, he'd had a gun put to his head, you know, he'd been isolated, all that stuff. And I said to him, how do you recover? How do you keep going? And he just had that little analogy. He said, you know, when deep sea divers go to the bottom of the ocean, they're going into a really dark place often. And we're called to go to dark places and tough places and to be there. But if you come up too quickly, what happens?
You get the bends.
You get the bends.
Yeah, that's it.
And so he said, the only way you can do this is to go gently. And then it started my head spinning around. I've never heard a decent sermon on gentleness. You know, it says, Jesus says, I'm lowly and gentle of heart. Gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. Paul says, if someone falls away, restore them gently. There's loads in Proverbs about gentleness. And the activist, L.R. Cross, says that gentleness is strength wrapped in peace. And I love that. And so I just like, me and my wife were like, and my friends, I often just text, go gently. Just a little bit of a reminder that we have to, because we won't survive.
Yeah, so powerful, Patrick. And it's lovely for me to like hear you talking about self-compassion, because I remember when you were in hospital having your legs rebuilt and you were coming out of, 20 years of really hardcore urban ministry where there was so much doing. You were struggling then to be like, I feel you, because it forced you to this sort of redundancy.
Yeah.
And just hearing you talking now about self-compassion, I remember saying to you, you've got to give yourself, like, just be kind to yourself, because there's nothing you can do but wait.
It was really interesting around that time, actually, because I remember you were saying that to me, and then the chaplain came to me, and I said, I'm really struggling to pray, and it's destroying me. And she goes, I've got one bit of advice for you. And I was like, okay, what is it? Don't pray. And I was like, hang on a minute. And she goes, you've got so much medication going through your body, so much stuff. We'll pray for you. Let us carry you. Let us be the people that take you into the presence of Jesus at this time. And it just dealt with that guilt and that shame, and I think that sometimes that is one of the, the key things is that self-compassion.
Yeah. There's this amazing Netflix documentary about a spiritual teacher who wrote this book that you may have read called How Can I Help? And it's for people in the helping professions. Right. And he's got very ill in his latter life, and he now is very dependent on carers. And in the interview he says, if I could go back in time and rewrite that book, I'd actually have called it How Can I Be Helped? Because he says, I feel I've learned more, and I've actually kind of encountered grace in a different way by finding a space of dependence and appropriate dependence, as well as always needing to be in that empowered mode of being the giver and potentially giving sort of down a power hierarchy.
So interesting what you said about that with Sam Wells' preaching about the Good Samaritan. I just the interpretation of it as a sort of a Western zeitgeist of like, of course you're the Samaritan man, being like strong and empowering and like giving money and like, and it's all kind of about you and your ego, ego needs, versus actually we are being rescued, we are dependent on Jesus, we are like the dependent ones.
Well, we're part of a bigger story that we are not the center of.
Yeah.
And that's that reframer you talking about, not needing to be the hero.
Yeah.
And there may be moments where it feels like we are being moved into a kind of hero moment, but it's about being part of a bigger story rather than it being...
I think Henri Nouwen was brilliant at this as well, because obviously he gave up a Harvard career to go and work with those that were physically and mentally disabled. And he said, I got more out of the relationship than they did, because it taught me how to be human. And it taught me about my own frailties, and it helped me face a lot of different things. And and then he wrote the book The Return of the Prodigal Son, which I just thought was one of his best works. And the two things that really stuck out for me was, number one is he says that we are the prodigal son every time we go and look for love in the wrong place. Because I was always like, I'm the second son, I'm working too hard. I was like, well, maybe I am the, because we all do that at times. We look for love in the wrong place. And then of course you have the second son who says, I've been slaving for you all these years, and we never know if he makes it into the party or not. It's like Netflix, like they leave us hanging. It's like, I need to watch the next episode.
Two. I know, well, Jesus, come on, this
what's going on? And but then like Henri Nouwen was like, whether you think you're the first son or the second son, the goal is always to be the father. Just love without an agenda. And I think sometimes we say, we'll love you if you join our church, we'll love you if you sign up for this discipleship course, we'll love you if this happens. But actually, when you love without an agenda, that frees us from actually looking for a success matrix, which often is where the world will look for a success matrix in terms of numbers. So we're looking more for outcomes. This is what I was just saying in the charitable sector. I said, I'm not really, in an XLP we used to drive people mad. I was going, I know outputs are really important, and I know numbers are important to funders, but you know what, I'm looking for outcomes. I just want to see tangible lives changed. Otherwise, you'll get loads of numbers, but what transformation has actually happened? And I think that's so crucial for leaders today.
Patrick, your story, you generously handed XLP on following your rehabilitation, which again we prayed about, felt like God was doing, and that charity is going from strength to strength on the foundation that you laid for it. And then you've moved into establishing, again, in the charitable sector, and now also working in the secular world, if you like, if we can call it like that, because you're still very much a man of God working in that world, in the area of emotional health, which is an absolutely incredible, I mean, it's a beautiful journey. You're living out now and training other people very much with like lessons in sustainable leadership and well-being, and that's happening. The education, I know you were teaching the NHS recently. Tell us a bit about, just as we wrap up today, that kind of transition out of this 22-year period of like the gangs and the guns and the buses, and now you're coaching and leading people in all sorts of spheres of influence around emotional health.
Yeah, I think obviously when I went for that major Tetris moment, and I was really broken, and I know it sounds really cheesy, and it does sound cheesy, but there is something about your mess becomes your message, you know, that sense of like, I know what it's like to be there. And particularly as a leader as well, it was lonely, it was isolating. I had a few good friends like yourself and others who were brilliant, but it is hard. And I was also really conscious that we have such a transformational message in terms of spirituality and spiritual health, as well as physical, mental and emotional health. And we know all those things connect together. And I remember I was sitting in my study one day, and I, like most Christian leaders, have hundreds of Christian books. And I was like, oh my goodness, I don't have one book I feel comfortable giving to the other dads at the school that's written by a Christian, that's around well-being and mental health. Because there's some brilliant books out there, but they're very much explaining the biblical, lots of Bible verses. And I was like, the other thing is, when I was going through my sort of breakdown period, everyone was trying to give me a book to read, and I couldn't even read a paragraph, not alone a book. So I was like, what would it be like to write something where actually, one is I can give it to the dads watching my kid play football, and two was so accessible that actually, even when you're going through a hard time, there'll be a tip on how to get to sleep, which is about half a page or something, you know. And so we stuck this book out into the world called Brighter Days. And what was really interesting was how people in communities picked up on it. Schools were giving it out to, one school bought 150 copies for every year 11 student, because they'd had 3 attempted overdoses in the school. I found out that they were being given out in chemo and radiotherapy units, in different hospitals. I heard stories. I had one lady come up to me and say, I'll take 100, please. And I was like, why are you taking that many? And she goes, you know, my 15-year-old son died by suicide. I'm going to give them out at the funeral service, along with the order service. Yeah. And I just felt challenged that so often what we do for people like myself is we stay within this Christian bubble. And I was like, what would it be like to be a Christian, but to communicate in business and the NHS? And, you know, I was in a women's prison a couple of days ago, which was just the most moving thing, you know, because women in prison, they're both victims and perpetrators, with so much trauma that they've been through. And just to be gentle and to be a man in that situation who actually isn't, you know, brutal in the way they communicate is really important as well. So with my little company, tiny company, called Brighter Days, a few speakers, just starting to reimagine what it could look like in society. One of my favourite theologians is Walter Brueggemann. He talks about, to be prophetic, you need to evoke grief at what is lost, but create amazement at what is possible. And I think, like, we need to do that. We need to say, you know, the fact that domestic violence is one of the biggest issues in society is wrong, but it's amazing if we could actually do something as the church about creating safe places and understand and you know, and I think there's so many issues like that we need to speak into. So yeah, I don't know where it's going to go, to be honest, and I'm scared. I'm scared and excited, and some days I'm like, oh, what are you doing? But I guess that's the normal place to be.
just as we wrap up today, you brought in a little catchphrase today that Will picked up on about thinking differently. Just remind us what that is and how you employ that.
Yeah, I sort of feeling about when I started Brighter Days, I was, again, to start it, I needed to downsize my house, just to give us a little bit of extra income, you know, in terms of less bills. And again, that felt really countercultural. And as I thought and prayed about it, this little mantra came to me, like, you know, start small, you know, go smaller. No one wants to go smaller at my age. Create some space, you know, space for creativity, space for doubt. I think doubt can be a really powerful force for good. Create space for some simplicity. My life got too complicated, too many meetings, too many committees. Create some space. And thirdly, think differently. And think differently about the future, you know, and think differently about power. You know, so much we talk about power over, you know, but obviously there's power with and power within and power to as well, which is much more around, which I think is the way power should be used. And so, yeah, it's just grappling with those things, because then I think when you have space to do that, you can be more creative and hopefully more authentic. And I think that's what we want, isn't it? We want authentic leaders where you're putting your real self out there rather than keeping this little bit hidden. So this sort of mask, so, you know, persona, which leader Patrick, but actually I think Jesus was the epitome of authenticity, and we need to be like that.
So start small, create space, think differently.
Yeah.
Love that. Patrick, what a treat. I mean, lots to talk about. Thank you so much for being on our show. It's such a privilege, and it's always like, again, I could go all day. We're so blessed by you, and continue. You know, we love you, love what you do, and love the impact you're having on the world. So thank you so much, and thank you for being with us on this episode of the Good Leader Podcast. I'm Will Vanderhart.
I'm Will James.
Until next time, goodbye. God bless.